So it depends what your need is. If you were a client and called me up, the first thing I would ask you is, what are you trying to fix? What are you trying to measure? Is the problem they don't have the skill because they can't type, or they don't understand Word or Excel or how to use a computer? Do they have a bad attitude? Do they not have the mental horsepower? Or do they just not fit into the culture? And which goes back to your attitude versus aptitude. Most people that are hired don't work out because they don't fit in somehow. They're either not motivated by the job, by the culture, or they don't get along with people.
We have the pleasure of welcoming Ira Wolfe today to our interview series. I'm Sumita Mariam from the peopleHum team. Before we begin, just a quick introduction of peopleHum. peopleHum is an end-to-end, one-view integrated human capital management automation platform, the winner of the 2019 Global Cody Award for HCM that is specifically built for crafted employee experiences and the future of work. We run the peopleHum blog and video channel, which receives upwards of 200,000 visitors a year, and publish around 2 interviews with well-known names globally every month. And now for our guest, Ira Wolfe is the president of Success Performance Solutions. He is a workplace futurist, candidate experience strategist, and an employee selection expert. He is a well-renowned TEDx speaker, author, and podcaster. Bringing with him a huge experience, his main interests also include HR trends, leadership skills, and hiring. We are very happy to have someone of his stature on our interview series today. Welcome, Ira. We're thrilled to have you.
It's my absolute pleasure to be here. I'm always excited about meeting new people and spreading the word around the world. And so I really appreciate the opportunity. And congratulations on all your success as well. So that's quite an achievement to be selected as one of the best in 2019. So hopefully you can do it in 2020.
Yeah, thank you for that. And let's move on to the interview now. So the first question, Ira, I had for you is, you've had quite a journey. Tell us a little bit about it. What was your vision as you started off?
Well, as many people say, they never thought they didn't. The first profession they had as a kid in school wasn't, oh, I want to be in HR. My journey started. Actually, I was a dentist. That was my career. So in 5th grade, don't ask me why. I talked about this in my TED Talk. Somewhere in 5th grade, they said, "What do you want to be?" And I stood up and said, "I want to be a dentist." And I guess I was too stubborn to give that up. So I actually did. I did practice. I went to dental school. I practiced. I was in the public health service. I had my own private practice for 15 years. But as I did mention in my TED Talk, I loved everything about dentistry but dentistry. I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I loved the business. I loved working with people. We had a very big team. I brought in an associate, so we had 17 people on our staff. We had lots of different personalities. But I enjoyed all of that part, but I didn't necessarily like, I didn't necessarily like the HR part as far as compliance, but as far as the people side of it, I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed running the business. So I sold that, hard to believe, 25 years ago and started this business. My initial idea was to work with professional practices, doctors, dentists, chiropractors, attorneys, accountants, and help them run their business better, because they, unlike me, they love their profession. They just hate running the business. But that was pretty hard. I mean, they weren't quite ready for that. It's 25 years later, and now they're more attuned to it, but we weren't there. So, but I always loved the assessment part, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit. I love the diagnostics. I always talked to, I said I probably was a better radiologist. I could have been a radiologist and diagnose the surgeries and diagnose problems and just not treat them. It was the treatment that was a little bit redundant. So eventually it took me a while to figure that out. And for the last 25 years, my business primarily has focused on the assessment part, pre-hiring, leadership development, helping companies identify the people that fit, but also helping the people grow and identify what their strengths and vulnerabilities are. But along the way, I'm a marketer at heart, and I wanted to know what the market was going to be, always anticipating. things. I do a lot of writing. Now I'm doing a lot of interview, video, audio, but I've always done a lot of writing. And so the futurist part, the kind of the research that I've done, and sort of what has established me as a futurist, whatever that is, was mostly because I was interested in where the business was going.
That's a wonderful journey and an amazing vision that you've had. And while going through your profile, we saw a very interesting title called Googleization Officer, if I'm right. And can you help our viewers understand what it is? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, it was partly a little bit of fun. I mean, I founded, my company is Success Performance Solutions. Actually, the corporate name is probably very appropriate now. It's Poised for the Future Company. So that was, so I've been incorporated, but we go by the brand name Success Performance Solutions. But along the way, I've written a number of books. I came up with Googleization in 2008 when I was writing Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization. And it was about the millennials were just starting to come into the workplace. And, we won't go into all the millennial stuff, but we talked about the 5 generations in the workplace and the millennials. Now we have Gen Z, as well. But the Googleization was just kind of a fun term. It was an alliteration. I talked about geeks and geezers, and was like, what was the third term? Was it technology? Geeks, geezers, and technology. And somewhere I came up with Googleization. So it sort of stuck. I decided the book needed to be updated and realized I didn't want to write about the 4 generations anymore, or the generations anymore. They're still important. I don't want to, make light of that, but there were bigger fish to fry, or bigger problems in the world to deal with. So I started to talk about how fast things were changing, and I changed the next book. Instead of being version 2.0 of Geeks, Geezers, Googleization, it became Recruiting in the Age of Googleization. A couple of people started calling me the Google guy. I'd go to a conference and they go, "Oh, you're the Google guy." And I didn't want to, that's trademark infringement. I didn't want to take on Google. So I came up with Googleization. I checked it out, and that's been a term that's been out there, and I was one of the first that coined it. So I became Chief Googleization Officer of my company, and maybe I don't know of any other person in the world that has that title. So so far, that's me.
That's very interesting. And concentrating a little bit on performance assessments, we hear that attitude eats aptitude for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. What sort of assessment models really work in candidate selection and performance assessment?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. As I said, my love's always been on understanding things, and again, if I was in healthcare, I guess I'd be a radiologist, and somebody who diagnoses things. But I use multiple assessments. So my first exposure to that was probably like everybody else's in their career, any type of career development, either using a DISC, the 4 behavioral styles, the DISC, or the Myers-Briggs, the MBTI. So basically behavior, to try to understand who you are, where you were. There's certainly vocational assessments that I've been involved with to identify what career path. I've not found those very helpful. If not, I wouldn't have been a dentist for sure. I would have probably pursued something else. But along the way, is I also learned that there was not one specific assessment that was the holy grail. I know a lot of people think that they think that they've solved human behavior problems because they have one assessment. I started to combine those, and I learned that pretty early when I started this business. I was introduced to a few additional ones. So I still use the DISC assessment, but we have a values assessment, because one, DISC talks about DISC, for those who aren't familiar with it, is talks about how I prefer to deal with problems, people, pace, and procedures. So it's the 4 Ps: problems, people, pace, and procedures. It means, am I energized about solving problems, or do I kind of back away? I'm not confrontational. Do I love interacting with other people, or do I tend to, am I loving this sheltering in place and these lockdowns because I don't have to see people? I can send them an email. So there's people that are energized by interacting and not. So I won't go into all that detail, but I realized that wasn't the whole picture. That didn't mean how smart I was. It didn't mean did I have a good attitude toward things. It didn't talk about what I valued. It didn't mean did I have the skills. So I started to combine a couple tools. So we use we do offer behavioral tools. We offer value, motivation tools. We look at people motivated by learning, by money, by power, by community, by helping others, by a particularly doctrine or a faith or a patriotism, and we talked about that. But I also use a lot of tools that are based on the big 5 personality factors. If you're familiar with those, the acronym is called OCEAN, OCEAN, and it stands for do you tend to be open-minded, which is very critical, very important these days. Do you tend to be open-minded? The C is conscientious. Do you tend to follow the rules or tend to bend rules? It doesn't mean you're moral or immoral, but it's how do you look at rules and traditions. E is for extroversion, which doesn't mean much of explanation. Are you introverted or extroverted? The A is agreeable. So do you tend to be more agreeable or more assertive, and cooperative? And then the N is non-emotional. Is self-control. How do you deal with stress? So that model has been used worldwide. It's been used. It's well validated. It happens to be non-biased, non-partial, and there's a lot of studies that have been done that relate it. Doesn't mean people are highly skilled at doing that, but it does mean do they have that basic capability? Is that they're hardwiring? And then next, how does that project into the job? Most important also is how does it fit into the culture? So we do a lot of the assessments I do are along with the other people's. We test for logical reasoning, verbal reasoning, spatial reasoning, inductive reasoning, focus. Can people be focused? Are they attentive to details? So we can test for software skills too. So it depends what your need is. If you were a client and called me up, the first thing I would ask you is, what are you trying to fix? What are you trying to measure? Is the problem they don't have the skill because they can't type or they don't understand Word or Excel or how to use a computer? Do they have a bad attitude? Do they not have the mental horsepower? Or do they just not fit into the culture? And which goes back to your attitude versus aptitude. Most people that are hired, there are some that are just don't have the skills, but most people that are hired don't work out because they don't fit in somehow. They're either not motivated by the job, by the culture, or they don't get along with the people. So it's important to assess both, but we assess everything from typing skills to leadership competencies. And we use a lot of different platforms. There's not, kind of the warning out there that despite what a lot of publishers and a lot of companies say, there's not one tool that covers it all.
Yeah, I mean, that was a wonderful answer. You have connected a lot of dots and gave us a clear idea about a lot of things there. Thank you so much for that one. And, from your experience, you've completed more than 2 decades in this industry. So how has human capital management changed in terms of how we hire, assess, measure and reward the employees? We've covered a little bit in the last answer, but, diving more into it.
Yeah, a lot of technologies made things a lot different because 25 years ago, even 20 years ago, and there's still some companies that do this, for frontline employees, for the lower level employees, it really wasn't affordable. I remember when I started the business, you were a software salesman. Originally, I'm giving away the age, you'd get a 5 1/4 inch disc, literally the floppy disk. It didn't hold a lot of information on there. And then they went to the 3 1/2 inch, but we would literally sell that and put a little dongle in the back of the computer so they can access that. And then we'd sell credits, but going through, now that everything's in the cloud, it basically made it very affordable for almost any company, even small. And we focus on the small, medium-sized business market. We have a couple large companies, but our niche is in that small, medium-sized, because what used to only be affordable to the Fortune, to large companies, the global 500 companies, is now available to everybody. The other thing that changed dramatically is for key positions, for leadership positions. you used to hire a psychologist, and the psychologist would interview the candidate. It was 3 or 4 hours of interviews. They would digest it, they write it up into a report, and 4 or 5 or 6 weeks later, they'd send the report over to the hiring managers. It cost a lot of money. It took a lot of time. And so I think technology has been the one thing that shifted that. Because now, somewhere, anyway, it depends on the assessment you're using, but between 10 and 30 or 40 minutes of time on the candidate's time, somebody goes in, you send the link, the candidate completes it, and the report's immediately available.
Yeah, that's quite a challenge. And I think the way you explained, how it has evolved is, quite interesting. And what would you recommend? What are your recommendations on how should, organizations approach building a standout culture, and so that, they can give a superlative employee experience?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and do that in just a few minutes is a bit challenging. But now is the perfect time to do it. I think as we talked before, and I'm just paraphrasing. I don't remember his exact words, but I said earlier about Warren Buffett said, when the tide went out, there were a lot of people, exposed a lot of people standing naked on the beach, and that's happened to companies that were pretty fragile. I'm sure you're familiar. Many of the listeners are familiar with the Gallup studies that have been done, and the global studies really showed that even before this, employee engagement, actively engaged individuals, at least in the US, was 30%, which means 70% were either disengaged or somewhat engaged. So there was really a very small percentage, and those statistics those surveys pretty indicated where things were worldwide. So as the tide rolled out, it really exposed, all their vulnerabilities, and now working remote, what's people loyalty? How engaged do they feel? That's all culture. I mean, and it's very difficult. The future is, I think the companies that have a strong culture, that have been pretty transparent and authentic, and contacting their employees and concerned about their employees. Obviously, companies have had to lay off people, to terminate the furlough people, to shut down in order to save their business. No one is going to be happy with that. But the way it's handled, there's people that got a text message or they got an email. There's other companies that have thousands of people, and they've had their hiring managers contacting their employees, even their furloughed employees, to make sure, is there anything they can do to help them? They've created resources, whether it was, hey, we identified local food banks that you're available for, or here's grants or loans. They've been their advocate. That's going to go a long way. A lot of companies, when this will be over at some point. It's not going to be short, and it's not going to be quick. But when it's over, the companies who truly had a good, sound culture based on values, they cared about their employees, they cared about the community they lived and worked in, they cared about their suppliers and their vendors, they treated everybody fairly, that's going to be a survivor. So if there's a silver lining within this pandemic, I think that it's going to really even give more focus on company culture and employee, both candidate experience, employee experience. There'll be a positive there, because that's the only way you're going to be able to survive. That's people will work for anybody for a little bit, because they're going to need a paycheck. But after that, it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think that's very right. All aspects of a business or an enterprise, I mean, the customers, the employees, the organization, the values and the identity has to match for all of them to stay, strong, especially at a time like this. So thank you so much for that answer. That was wonderful. And how would you advise, smaller companies who are, struggling to build a talent brand, to focus on building one so that they attract the right talent?
Yeah, again, another important, topic, especially now. I mean, I think people are breathing a sigh of relief. I know, especially in the U.S., where unemployment, as I said, was the unemployment rate was about 3.5% just a few weeks ago for skilled labor for the talent that people needed. In many places it was well under 2%, 1.5%. So it was difficult. For small, medium-sized businesses, it's actually easier than large company brands because a lot of small businesses didn't focus on that before. The employment brand, the talent brand, people, I believe, are going to want to work for smaller businesses rather than large corporations. Again, because it's a lot easier even to do social distancing on a small company, a little bit more innovative, entrepreneurial than corporate. I know, anyone who lives in any of the cities, New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, I mean, any of the cities, is really struggling with how do they even get people up in elevators. You have a 50-story building, and how do you do safe distancing in an elevator? So in a small company, you don't worry about that unless your small company was in one of those buildings, but it would be much easier to relocate that small business. So from branding, first things I would say is, one is it's incredibly important that you have a message out there. Simply stating I'm a small business and, don't use small business. I think this is the biggest mistake. Small businesses tend to sometimes use small business as an excuse. And they start out by saying, well, we're small. We can't pay you as much as a big company. You're going to have to work harder. We don't have all the resources. They tell all the reasons that they give somebody all the reasons not to work there. But small companies have a huge opportunity. They're a little bit more nimbler. They're nimbler, not more nimbler, but they're nimbler. They're more agile. There's a more personal relationship. Smaller companies, other than restaurants, certainly didn't have as much of an issue sending people home and working remote, where a lot of large companies did, because people relied on the company to provide all the infrastructure, all the direction, where people in smaller companies were a little bit independent. So I think it's easier than most small business owners think, but there's a real opportunity out there to start building your brand.
That's a very interesting answer, and I loved how you covered a lot of things, like from small businesses trying to make excuses to how we can make this time more productive, even if you're a small, medium, or large business. However, it's the time to build up and not sit lazily behind. That's a beautiful message that you can give to our viewers. And Ira, just to kind of wrap up the interview, if you have any important sound bites that you would like to leave our audience.
Yeah, one is, if anybody has any questions, I provide a ton of information for free. There's a couple easy ways. One is you can just go up to my website and contact me. But I created a community online. It's called, sticking with the theme, Googleization. It's called Googleization Nation. It is a free community, so you can go to googleizationnation.com, and all we need is an email. That's about it. A name, a first name, and an email. And each week, or more often, I send out updates. So, like for this week, tomorrow I'm doing a live stream video with his name's Perry Marshall. He's he's literally one of the top business strategies in the world. We're going to be talking about. He has something called the slingshot theory, or slingshot recovery. That how do you come out of this with a growth mindset? How do you seize the opportunity? He introduced me to a new term. It's a Greek word. It's called kairos. It's Kairos. And there's two measurements of time. There was the chronological one, which is what date is it, and where we fit. And kairos is the time for opportunity. I love that. It's a time for opportunity. And now's the time for opportunity. So within that, we're going to be talking about that. Wednesday, I've got a podcast, which is now called the Geek Skis and Googleization podcast. We interview experts just like you are about what's happening. On Thursday, I'm talking with Dr. Chuck Coker. We're talking about trust. He actually has a new assessment out there, how to measure, do people trust you? It looks at transparency and relatability and other factors. And then we got a panel in the afternoon with 3 experts that we're doing a live stream. And all those are free. And the panel is about what work's going to look like going forward. So that's just this week alone. Plus articles. So the easiest way to probably track it is Googleization Nation. And if you actually do a join, JOIN, .Googleization Nation, My new book, the second version of my second edition of my book, Recruiting in the Age of Globalization, I'm giving away for free, and you can go up to that. So those are probably the two best ways of keeping up with things. We've got a lot of other free resources and interviews I do, and I post them online. YouTube, again, I'm doing a lot of video, and you can connect with me on LinkedIn.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for all that information. I'm sure our audience are going to have a productive time going through all of that. Thank you so much, Ira. I had a wonderful time. I mean, the last 30 minutes was so good for me, so enriching for me. And I'm sure it will be for our audience also. Thank you for your time and energy. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Hey, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Stay safe, everyone.